Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's webinar, 42 Crunch webinar on API breaches in the first half of 2022. So today's webinar is, as I said, on some of the high-profile breaches in the first half of the year. An introduction to myself, my name is Colin Dominy. I'm an API security research specialist and developer advocate here at 42 Crunch. And I also have the great pleasure of curating the APIsecurity.io newsletter. And the content you're going to be seeing today is all breaches that we featured in this. So this webinar, it's a first part of a two-part series. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be looking at some of the breaches that we focused on. Now, what we want to do here is we want to realize that mistakes happen to everybody. Right, often very simple things can happen. Mistakes can be very costly as well, and we'll look at that. But most of all, and what I want people to take away from this is the learning opportunity that we have. Right, we can actually learn from the misfortune of others, and how some, sometimes fairly benign, simple mistakes can end up being very, very costly. And the good news is that these mistakes can often easily be detected. All right, we'll look at examples where very simple precautions could have prevented the issues. And as I said, this is the first of a two-part. Today is quite a lot of presentation. There's not much technical detail. It's understanding kind of what happened in the narrative. The second part, which will run in just over a month, that's going to be much more technical. That'll be hands-on. That'll be code examples. That'll be showing you how to actually fix these problems with code. And obviously with the 42 Crunch product. So, please, if you be more technically minded, that's a useful follow-up. And if you register today, you'll automatically get invited to that as well. Right. So I've anonymized the names of all the companies involved. They are featured in the newsletter. If you that way inclined, you can go and find out further details. So the first issue affects a global shipping company, and what researchers did is they discovered that the web portal, allows customers to submit a tracking number. Right? We've all seen these tracking numbers, a standard format, and if the tracking number was valid, then it would return a little JPEG that could be rendered on a web page with the approximate location of where the parcel was. Now, what the researchers discovered was that there was no rate limiting on that API, and they could quite easily guess, just sequence through things that looked like valid parcel tracking numbers. And when they got a success, in other words, they got an image back, they could actually look at the image. And this was an attack based in the UK, and they discovered that they could work out the postcodes by just looking at the image. And then by having the tracking number and the postcode, they could actually get the full information about that parcel, right? What the website wanted to do was just, give the delivery time or the driver's name, but actually it dumped out the entire PII of that customer, right? So fairly disastrous, fairly big impact. Let's just have a look at some of those visuals. So, that's the kind of map that you would get. If you live in the UK, you'll know that from that you could probably guess the postcode pretty easily. And then once you've got the postcode, then you can get that data back from and it had everything in there. It had the mobile name, numbers, and the full address. So the issue here, how was this addressed? So obviously the shipping company took this very seriously, jumped on this. There was a responsible disclosure program. The company affected asked the researcher not to reveal this until, obviously it had been fixed and some time had passed. The impact here could have been massive. It wasn't, but it could have been massive because that attack was relatively easy to automate. Obviously, there was that little go-between where you had to assess the visuals of the map, but that could have also been automated. So the two fundamental causes here, these are both API top 10 vulnerabilities. Lack of rate limiting. They should rate limit that to stop brute force guessing parcel numbers. And then excessive information exposure. They didn't need to return all of that information. They were, they were returning PII where they just needed to return some very basic. So kind of textbook stuff here. What did we learn to do? Protect brute force attacks and only disclose the information that you absolutely need. The second one is a nice one, campus access control. So basically a curious user discovered in the US that he had a mobile app that he used to unlock his door in his campus room. He got frustrated with the app, so he reverse engineered the API and then discovered that using that he wanted a script. He wanted to do something, think something with Apple script to be able to automate his door opening. But what he did while he was doing this is he discovered that if he guessed somebody else's email address, and obviously it's on a campus, so people's email addresses are easily guessable, he found that they didn't authenticate properly. So using his credentials, he was able to access other people's accounts. And then he also found that he could, just by sequencing, he could get access to their door controls. So what he was able to do is he effectively made himself a master key for the entire campus, right? The impact was unknown, probably quite limited. And the fundamental causes here: broken function level authorization and broken authentication, right? So the APIs weren't, the API endpoints weren't authorized properly, and there was total lack of authentication as well. So, you know, the takeaways here, those are also top API top 10 issues. Also make sure that you can revoke any sessions or keys. So what he did discover in this is that if he had an existing session, they never revoked that session key. Just see, we've got a question about the parcel tracking. So the parcel numbers, sequential or random, they were semi-sequential with a particular regex pattern that could be quite easily guessed and sequenced through. So, right, the third one is a microbrewery application. This was a UK-based microbrewery, and this is a really bad one. This is one of these where, you know, they only have themselves to blame, if I'm honest. They used hard-coded tokens in the application. They relied on security by obscurity. You can have a look on the left. There's the tokens that were found in the APK of the Android application. And what the researchers were able to do is they were able to use that and to access this. Also had, you know, basically that's a hard-coded token that allows everybody to access anybody else's account. They were able to guess people's UIDs or identifiers. It was quite a discernible, I think it was a sequential pattern. And then they were simply able to get to everybody's account, including things like, we looked in that image, all the PI of the customers, and also they were able to access the token codes to allow them to get beer discounts. So effectively, we're able to get free beer. You know, the lessons here are, you make sure that you can revoke sessions and keys and tokens. Obviously, if you hard-coded that into your application, you know, that's almost the hardest thing you can do. There's only one worse scenario if it's an embedded system. But that's a pretty bad one. Lack of design. Use standard mechanisms for key distribution, token distribution, like OAuth. Right? There's a reason these things exist. Cryptocurrency portal, right? This is the biggest vulnerability, the most severe one. This effectively allowed an attacker to print unlimited currency, right? And this is also the best example I've seen of BOLA, broken object level authorization. So what happened here is a cryptocurrency portal allowed traders to trade in a variety of currencies. They could have different wallets in different currencies. And the attack vector was as follows. So the attacker would have a currency account that had funds in it, and then they would have one that didn't have funds. And they would set up a transaction to go between the one that didn't have funds to purchase currency. And then when the platform validated the account, it verified that the account existed and that it had currency in it. But when they put the transaction through, what they did is they just switched the ID to the other account that didn't have funds, right? And then what happened is the API that did the transaction processing never validated the account ID, right? So they're able to at transaction time just switch the ID to an account that didn't have funding, right? So effectively could make unlimited transactions from a zero value account, and obviously that's as pretty much as severe as it could get. This was a textbook case of responsible disclosure and immediate response from the platform, as one might expect. And I think this was fixed within hours of being divulged. So Bola's number one on the list of the API top 10. There's a good reason for that. And also bug bounties. This was worth $250,000, right? So if you highly profitable if you know what you're doing. A dating application, I do recommend going and finding this one on the apizsecurity.io. The write-up of this is one of the best that I've read. It's very entertaining, as well as being just seeing how clever attackers can be. So some of these are complete, gotchas that are really obvious and really bad mistakes. But this one, the attacker really had to use a lot of cunning and ingenuity to get the exploit. So the concept, the picture's worth 1,000 words. Let's have a look at this. So what we had here, there was a dating application that allowed users to view people that they were connected to in a kind of table grid array, and then work out who was closest to them. And what the platform designer intended to do was give an approximate location, right? So, to a couple of, to a mile or so. But what they did is, if you can have a look in on the left-hand screen, on the left-hand box there, they returned a very, very, very precise location, distance information. And then what the attacker did is he worked out that he could use trilateration techniques. So if you've got 3 points, make a triangle, plot point, get to the middle of that, and you can work out the exact location. And he worked out he could do that. Now, that wasn't the worst of the issues. The other problems were he discovered Bola. What he was able to do is, by looking at the GUI and looking at in a browser, he was able to find other users' identifiers, and then be able to get the information. Let me think what else this application did. So when they validated the user, they did client-side, they did a token generation on the client side, right? And we know that's not a great idea. They did that in JavaScript. They tried to obfuscate the code, but obviously it's quite easy to just reverse engineer and find that and generate your own session tokens. So, and then he was able to, effectively imitate as many users as he wanted to, because he'd worked out how to be able to find their IDs, right? So he could get anybody's location and the distance between that. So a nice one here, because we've got a couple of things going wrong. So again, we've got Bola. We've got excessive information exposure. So absolutely no need to be returning the distance to that level of precision. Obviously, the UI truncated that and just displayed an approximate location. But obviously, if it's coming over the API, the information's there. And security by obscurity, these guys trying to do a lot of things by hiding and masking. And obviously, if you're doing anything on client side, you're out of luck. Right, so good learning one there. Go and find that one, because that's a great write-up. WordPress, no highlights package would be complete without mention of WordPress. The most common attack vector for WordPress is plugins. There's nearly every other week there's some vulnerable plugin. This one, fairly typical. A WordPress plugin had an endpoint that didn't have function level authorization. So basically, it allowed anonymous access. And then they had other endpoints where they validated the access, and if the access was incorrect or didn't access, they fell through to a default handler which allowed full access. Right, that's fairly typical of things that we see. Your handlers that are doing the authentication authorization. Make sure that those are pretty well inspected. Poor default settings on that endpoint handler The impact, as ever with WordPress, is effectively once you get authenticated onto the platform, it's easy to be running at elevated privileges. A lot of plugins also don't check the roles. They just give you effectively the WordPress base permissions, root permissions effectively. So make sure that all your function and endpoints are fully authenticated and authorized, and then code defensively. Right, there's a lot of manual code review would have found that, and those things can also be automated. This was a pretty complex one. I like this one because it's a good example of how a number of relatively benign things can lead to a complete compromise of a system. Right. So a researcher was working, and this was a financial services platform of some sort. He didn't divulge what it was, but he discovered a number of issues, and there's a load of them there. So let me think. The first one that he discovered Bowler on the creation of an object, and he discovered a way to find other identifiers of accounts. And then he found that he was able to just mimic and submit those identifiers and then get access. So that's Bowler. He also found an unauthorized function. Jot validation. They failed to correctly sign the Jot token, so he was able to manipulate claims in the Jot token. He discovered credentials, tokens committed to source code repositories. He also discovered that the GUI leaked UUIDs in the GUI. He also discovered that the API leaked API tokens, which he could reuse. So he could grab a token from the UI and he could use that on the API. So, split that, make that, remember that anything that's in your GUI is going to be visible. So make sure that you segment and separate those tokens. The other one he detected was a fun one. He had an endpoint that took a UUID, and what he discovered is if he didn't submit a UUID, it actually gave him one at random. So one can only imagine there's some, coding shortcut that's been taken there, and it was just leaking. So he just found that if he hit that endpoint, he could just enumerate UUIDs. We come to a couple of embedded systems now. So this affected a well-known load balancer product that allowed a remote code execution vulnerability. Now, fairly typical of these embedded systems, they often have a management portal, either on a GUI, or they'll expose an endpoint, which allows you to run commands. These things are generally very dangerous and rife to, being exploited and, bad things happening on this. So in this case, what did they do? They had an endpoint that allowed remote access to the platform config, and attackers could then discover a command shell endpoint, which wasn't publicly exposed, but they could find this via the platform configuration. And unfortunately, that endpoint didn't require any authentication. So you basically got root level access to these load balancers. This was a big one. It made a lot of news. There were no reported breaches, which I think is down to good fortune rather than anything else. And the vendor moved very quickly to patch this. And they also offered pretty good interim advice, which was obviously disable this functionality and take these things off public, take that interface, that management interface, make sure that wasn't on a public network. Impact was potentially large, 16,000 of these systems exposed on the internet. Root cause broken authentication, there wasn't any at all, never mind being broken, non-existent. Take homes there, ensure all API endpoints are authenticated. We look at the end at some remediation advice and guidance, but then also reduce that attack surface, right? So here's a good example of insecure defaults. Why have the management interface enabled by default? Surely the sensible approach is to make it disabled, and then you have to explicitly enable it. And then a home route on the other end of the embedded spectrum. And this is pretty typical of anybody, if anybody's ever tinkered with one of these little home routers. Let me show you what I mean by that. So on the left, we have the usual kind of admin page that you have on these. And somewhere over there, there's a little utility that somebody thought would be useful, which allows you to ping arbitrary IP addresses. But of course, what they're vulnerable to there is they're vulnerable to OS command injection. So by doing that, you're able to do a directory listing. What the researcher then discovered is he grabbed that URL, messed around in Burp, and he discovered that although the web UI gave him a session token, he could actually emit the session token from the API call and still have access. So what have we got there? We've got entirely broken authentication. They had a session token, but they never checked it, right? And then the other issue that made this dangerous was, normally you have to be sat in front of the router and have physical access to it. What we had here is a case of cross-site request forgery, where you could, let me think how this attack worked. So you would have a website that had a link to a local IP address, and then what happened when the person with one of these routers clicked that, it would obviously open up that page, attempt to connect to that router, drop a payload in and do the exploit. So there's an example in Burp where you could easily cut the password file. Right? It's just a way of dumping the password. And of course, the fact that we didn't need authentication meant that could be done fully remotely. These things are common in this type of device. It's due to the fact that they're often low-end, low-cost devices. They're using kernels that aren't hardened, aren't patched properly, aren't maintained. They probably haven't got the right levels of security expertise on this, and things can quite easily go wrong. Broken authentication, and then more on the traditional web app stuff, cross-site request forgery, an easy way to get remote access to systems. Again, lessons learned, it's obvious, right? Make sure that all endpoints are authenticated. And again, this is the same point, remove that attack surface. If you've got one of these type of routers, disable that functionality unless you really need it. And cross-site request forgery has been around for the better part of 2 decades. There's tried and tested protection mechanisms. A lot of libraries will actually have built-in CSRF protection mechanisms. Make sure you use those. 2 more to go. This is also a great write-up. This is probably the best bit of research on the that I've had in the last 6 months. So the researchers were engaged to do a pen test, basically on a smart scale, and particularly on the back end of the system. And what they did is another great example where they chained a number of relatively benign vulnerabilities to totally compromise the system. They could totally take over the account using a password reset function. Let's go have a look at what they did. So a couple of things that they discovered here. They found that another issue with this is they found that a lot of the limits on account creation were implemented in the UI, and they were able to use the API to effectively create unlimited accounts. On the left, this is a good one here. So this is excessive information disclosure. And in fact, this is as bad as it gets. So there's an auth exchange going on there. They're getting let's just get a cursor so you can see what we've got. So they're returning the access token on the API call, which is fair enough, I guess. But what they also do is they return the refresh token over there, right? So you've now returned over the API, you've returned the access token and the refresh token. So effectively, you've now disabled your tokens. You can't, you've given people lifetime access. They can just keep refreshing their token. So that was one of the leakage vectors. The password reset issue, which allowed the account takeover. This was the standard password reset where you key in an email and you get the email saying a password reset has been initiated. Here's your 6-digit code. What they did over here is obviously just use Burp's repeat function to go and repeat and step that password sequence. And the way that the API developers tried to protect themselves on a brute force attack here is to put like a nonce code in the front. But what they didn't do is if the reset function failed due to an invalid code, they forgot to reset the nonce. So basically what could happen is that they just had unlimited access to that reset function. So they tried to do the right thing, but unfortunately didn't get it quite right. There was also BOLA and excessive data exposure. So they were also leaking PII of registered users and broken authentication on other users' accounts. So there were, I think, up to 6 different distinct vulnerabilities in this. So obviously the folk who developed that backend just hadn't prioritized security. Good example of how multiple vulnerabilities can lead to total compromise. And what was also bad about this one, and I think this one is unique. No, there's the last one. There's how badly the vendor handled this. They ignored the initial requests for disclosure. They then didn't respond to the disclosure, and it took them 7 months to finally remediate all of this. So, if you're going to, and let's be honest, everybody's going to be attacked. Statistically, the odds are you're going to have a breach or an incident. Make sure you've got a plan for remediation and mitigation. Right? These guys simply didn't. Automation platform. So this is an industrial automation platform that's widely used. And again, we've got an example of an RCE over a remote admin point, very similar to the load balancer issue. There was a secondary issue here. There was also a file transfer point which allowed file transfers. But unfortunately, what this allowed attackers to do is overwrite the local file system, right? So they could manipulate the path, very standard attack vector, try and manipulate the paths. And that remote code execution, there was again an admin endpoint. I think this gave a direct bash shell, and it wasn't authenticated at all. In fact, it attempted to be authenticated because it required a username and password, but it accepted empty strings for both of those. So they'd kind of got halfway there, but not entirely. Again, make sure that all endpoints, we talk about function level or broken authentication, and at the end, there's a lot of things that you can do to avoid falling into that trap. Reduce your attack surface, and at the operating system level, just make the OS file system read only. Once it's booted, and that'll prevent catastrophic things happening. In this case, an attacker could have totally brick the system and have a full-on denial of service attack. Okay, the last one is a real PR disaster for the impacted company. This has been ongoing for some years now. So there's an attack that can be launched against a SaaS CI/CD platform. And researchers discovered that the platform offers an API endpoint to retrieve logs for files. It's got a fairly complex numbering scheme and identifier scheme. But what they discovered is that by manipulating, playing with that, and enumerating that endpoint, they could actually access all system logs, including ones that were marked as deleted or were archived. Right, so they found that they could, I think they were able to get something like 17 million distinct log files. And we know that these platforms are normally logging in there. They're logging confidential information. So what they did is they discovered that there were Docker passwords, there were GitHub credentials, there were AWS secret keys. Second thing they tried to do was, and this is a curious one as to why it was done like this. So they discovered that in some cases, some of the tokens were masked. Right, that's the recommended practice. If you are writing things to logs, obfuscate and mask it. Some of them were, and some of them weren't. So this points to the fact that they weren't using a standard library. They had different teams doing different functions. So obviously some kind of code review cleanup was necessary there. Well, what the researchers found that they could do, and this was Aqua Security, their research team who discovered this, leakage of tens of thousands of credentials. right? And they actually contacted many of those third parties, GitHub and AWS, who were rightly fairly horrified that this could have come to happen. And then, interestingly, the vendor claims that this is by design, and they simply told the users not to delete logs. Right? That's the mitigation. So, and I think this is ongoing, and it's been going on for a couple of years now. So, if you are running a CI/CD, maybe go and have a look at that, because you need to be aware. Make sure that you're not committing secrets and things to logs, and if you are, the lessons learned there, if you are doing that, especially to things like GitHub, which is your crown jewels, make sure that you have a plan for revoking and reissuing those credentials. These guys did have rate limiting, but it wasn't sufficient to stop this. Remember, rate limiting is pretty much a mitigation. It's not an out and out protection. If you're patient enough, and you don't have detection behind your rate limiting, you can just sit and, in the fullness of time, defeat that. And these guys also relied on security by obscurity. They hoped that people wouldn't guess the API endpoints. It was a fairly obtuse numbering scheme, but of course that's also quite easily done. Okay, impact there obviously pretty big as well. Right, so that's all the breaches that I've covered. As I said, what was interesting was looking at the top ranking issues. So I've ranked these according to occurrence, and of course, not surprisingly, we have Bowler, the API number one, also our number one, still top of the charts. The other ones, the usual suspects are in there. There was broken authentication, came up a number of times. I think there were 4 there. But, broken authentication, there's a number of fairly, absolute howlers where people just didn't have any authentication, never mind being broken. And then people are still reliant on security by obscurity. I know that's not a specific API issue. That's just general bad practice. Hard-coded tokens, and then some of the old favorites, cross-site request forgery. So quick tips here. As I said, this is a very high-level overview of things that we recommend. You can get these tips and guides on the APIsecurity.io website. For Bowler, there's a couple of ways that you can protect that. If we just understand what Bowler is, it's attackers being able to guess object identifiers that may or may not belong to them, right? So you're able to guess somebody else's account ID. The ways to prevent this, it's generally quite a hot, what we recommend in the first instance is always absolutely authorize access to any object explicitly at any point in the code, right? So fully, the cryptocurrency platform that we looked at, their mistake was they did one transaction where they validated the account ID, but then when they came to do the purchase, they forgot to revalidate that, right? So make sure you're explicit about that, and make sure that you've got well thought out policies and a hierarchy of rules. The question about the random or sequential IDs that we had, don't use random IDs. Don't use ones that can be guessed. That's a mitigation. That's not a solution to the problem. Use random UIDs, and then also don't expose directly to your API. Don't expose the identifier. So have a token where the UID is exchanged for the actual object identifier in your backend. And also don't trust IDs that the client sends. Right? If you're doing things in claims, if you've got JOT tokens, if you've got session IDs, embed the identifiers in the claim or the session, rather than relying on something on an API, because obviously that can be very easily manipulated. Broken authentication. So loads of reasons why this happens. Weak passwords that aren't checked. We had an example of that. Passing credentials and keys and URLs, that's not a great idea, because those will get written to logs and they can be observed in transit. Poor JOT token validation. We spoke with Philippe Durek earlier in the year. He's the guru on that. Go and look up Philippe's work on Jot token validation. We had an example today of somebody not doing that correctly. How to prevent. So there's obvious things there. Protect your password reset and one-time access. We saw an example where the platform got that wrong and allowed password resets. Use standard methods, backup authentication with multi-factor authentication. Use short-lived tokens. Don't expose your refresh token. That would be a top tip. And anything that requires password checks, and that make sure that you're rate limiting to prevent being brute forced on that. The other thing I'd say from a code developer point of view is broken authentication. It's one of those things that is actually relatively easy to find in code reviews and can be relatively easily automated. So for example, if I'm a .NET programmer, so I know what the decorators look like for authorization in .NET, authentication authorization look like in .NET. So it's easy using a grepping tool like semgrep to just trawl your code base and go and have a look for, are all my things that are API endpoints, and those are obvious in the code, are those fully authenticated? And then, of course, we would also recommend, 42 Crunch would recommend that you fully specify your authentication and authorization mechanisms in your open API contract. And then obviously, if you're auditing that on a continuous basis, you have immediate feedback when you're having endpoints that are at risk of open access. Right, so this is one of these that's a persistent and prevalent problem, but it's also one that's relatively easy to fix. And the other one that's easy to fix is excessive information exposure. We had loads of examples where people were returning too much information or information that was too precise and relying on filtering on the client side. The root cause here is I'm going to say there's two root causes. One is ORMs, object relational mappers, which make it very easy and convenient for developers to just take data out of a database and expose it on an API. You know, from a efficiency point of view, this is fantastic because they don't have to write any translation code. From a security point of view, it isn't, because you overexpose information. And then the other issue is that developers, you know, they will use that feature because it gets the job done, but they don't think of those downstream consequences. Many ways to protect. So, you know, that first one, we saw examples of people relying on client filtering. Don't, you know, just don't do that. You know, your web UI is just, you know, it's just a bit of glossy front end. It's anybody's going to be able to access your data, your APIs, even if it's a mobile app. You know, you very easily put a man in the middle proxy on that and dig out all the API information. From a data privacy point of view, make sure that you understand and classify your data. You know what the consumers need, what kind of data should be returned. Make sure that you don't leak information in your error responses, and response checks. So validate that data. So the way to do this, when I said this is an easy one to solve, it's quite easy to find in code reviews. And of course, if you've got an open API contract that is defining the data contract, the response contract, and you fully specified your data objects, we looked at that issue where we had a distance that was overly verbosely specified. We could have quite easily put a regex around that data field to make sure that we were only exposing, you know, 1 decimal point, right? And then once you have the contract definition in place, then you can enforce that with firewalls or with gateway products to enforce that contract. Okay, so those are some tips, fairly high level things, fairly obvious things in many cases on what to do with excessive information exposure. That is the conclusion of the webinar. So what I do now is I'm just going to give you a heads up on what's happening on the next one in July. So I've looked at some of these breaches and I've given you the high level detail. What we'll do in the next one is we're going to go into code examples. I'm going to mock up a couple of those issues, show you how it looks in code, show you those exploits, show you how to fix. I'm just going to pick at random different frameworks, different languages. and then also how you can prevent that. 42 Crunch, obviously, we have solutions that are designed to help you solve those problems. And we're going to have a look at how that works. So it'll be a lot more technical, a lot more hands-on. It'll almost entirely be demonstration. If anything, there's any breaches of interest in the next month, I'm sure there will be. I'll feature those as well. And then obviously, if you want this kind of news on vulnerabilities to API news, there's the APIsecurity.io newsletter. So I'm going to take questions now if folk have if folk do have questions. There's plenty of time left, so do feel free to ask. Token storage, so embedded systems, that's quite a difficult one for for tokens. It's quite easy. That APK where they committed tokens into the APK, that's an obvious reason that we have standard token exchange frameworks like OAuth 2. That seems to be increasingly common. That focus seeming to be hard coding. There's lots of issues where people are actually hard coding tokens. So that's one to watch as well. General secrets management is always important. Right, so I don't have any more questions. If you want to pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on this, the second part of this webinar. Is going to be much more technical, and we're going to look at some code and upcoming events from 42 Crunch. We've got a lot going on at the moment. We're on the DevOps Days tracks in Amsterdam. That's happening tomorrow. In fact, San Jose, Charlotte, we're at API World in Dallas. So as I said, we've got the next installment of this webinar next month. We've got the APIsecurity.io newsletter, and we've got a free download of our tools. Head over to that URL. Question on, can we assume that SOAP API is more by design, is more secure by design than REST API? So no, I don't think it's necessarily inherently more secure. I think you can probably do bad things with both sets of both types of APIs. If you get things wrong, then you can do it on either. And yeah, no, a lot of the questions, a lot of the issues here were things that are not specific to APIs. But yeah, there's normally some, there'll be some issue around the, secret credentials, being committing your credentials into GitHub, not necessarily an API specific thing. Right, good. Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, so that's closed. That's closed. No questions on the Q&A. So with that, without any further ado, I wish you luck, and I wish to see you here next month. Thank you very much.